good morning, and welcome to this panel on the the EU's global engagement in a multipolar world. Yes, my name is Poppelkvist, and I will be moderating the panel today. And I've been looking very much forward to this, both because of the very distinguished panel that we will have, but also because the theme of this panel aligns perfectly with my research area here at DIIS, which is the global role of the European Union and the EU-Africa relations. So in this panel, we will zoom in on yet another aspects of the EU's external relations, which are challenging, and an aspect where the EU, to refer something that was said yesterday, just because not everyone was here yesterday, an area where the EU has might have woken up, but is definitely not out of bed and fully dressed yet. And that is the international partnerships. With Africa, yes, but also with other potential allies. Because in these times of growing multipolarity in the world, it is increasingly clear that all allies are up in the air. And all alliances are up in the air. And that places new and increased demands on the EU's geostrategic actions as well. As the minister stressed yesterday, it is imperative for Denmark that Europe is stronger and that Europe is playing a much larger role in the world. And at the same time, we see that the EU is moving surprisingly slow when it comes to establishing international partnerships. And the partnerships that we then see, in those one can certainly question the substance, as Richard also mentioned yesterday. So in this panel, we will explore what's potentially holding the EU back at the moment in terms of international relations, and also what could be a way forward, and how could the EU maybe be inspired by some of its big partners like Turkey in a future approach in this area. So joining me on the stage, I'm very happy to welcome three very knowledgeable panelists. We have Ambassador Birgitte Markussen from the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we have Professor Senem Aydin-Düzgit. Yeah, thank you. For Sabanci University. And policy analyst Amandine Sabourin from ECDPM. And this panel is divided into 3 rounds, in which each panelist will first give their own perspective of the EU's global engagement until now. Then we will address the EU's main challenges and even suggest a way forward, because we will not leave you hanging there with only the challenges. And then, of course, I will. If we have time, I will ask some questions as we go along, and hopefully we will also have time for questions from you in the audience in the end. So, but let's start. Amandine, you are a policy analyst in ECDPM's Foreign Affairs and Development Policy team. You specialize in EU and international development cooperation, including the ACP-EU relations. Yeah, and you hold a PhD in EU development policy. So, Amandine, will you take us through some of the main changes in the EU's approach to its international partnerships in the recent years?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Does it work? No, still not. I think it works now. Yeah. Does it work? Good morning. Good morning. Yeah, perfect. So good morning, everyone, again. Thank you very much, Sarah, and also to the organizers for having ECDPM here this morning. We just... Before answering your question, just as ECDPM is not part of TEPSA, just wanted to say that we're a Think and Do Tank based in Maastricht in the Netherlands and with an office in Brussels where I myself am based. So yeah, to start off to kick off the discussion on the changes of the EU's approach to international partnerships. Maybe the first general idea is to mention is that there is indeed a systemic change in the EU's approach since 2021. The EU has set a new framework for international partnerships, as you might know, with a new strategy, the Global Gateway Strategy, that focuses a lot more on infrastructure, investments, aiming at raising investments from the resources from the private sector. Also with a new instrument, the Neighborhood Development International Cooperation Instrument, that brings a new way of working and addresses some big challenges. Actually, one of the big challenges to address multiple geographic and thematic areas at the same time, and then a new way of working together among the EU and the member states that is called the Team Europe approach. That all brings a more interest-driven, a more transactional approach, moving away from the traditional development cooperation way of working with partner countries. And one key element here to take into account seems to be how to find a way to reconcile what some researchers call the trilemma, basically reconcile the promotion of the values, the defense of the EU's interests, and the partnership and ownership priorities of the partners themselves. And this needs really to be taken into account when the EU speaks about renewing the relationship with partner countries and organizations. In addition to all that, we are aware of the big external drivers, but also the internal challenges that the EU is facing. So externally, of course, there is this unprecedented geopolitical instability since the COVID-19 crisis, with the ongoing wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. There is also an increasing, increasing global power rivalries and strategic competitions. And last but not least, maybe the Trump administration, the second administration of Trump, then that brings a lot of uncertainty regarding the future of international partnerships, but also of transatlantic partnerships, of course. Internally, the EU faces some challenges as well, as the economy is stagnating, and there are some competitiveness concerns. There is a rising populism in Europe, and security and defense are now the #1 priority in Europe. All that have had a lot of consequences on the relationship with the partners across the world, with Africa in particular, but not only. And we already saw that how the Global South received the EU's positioning around the COVID-19 crisis, around the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and now there is a lot of uncertainty on how this will evolve since the withdrawal or the turn taken in the US. So this all invites, I think the conclusion of this is that it invites the EU to rethink its priorities, really, sorry, to when the EU is focusing on more inward-looking priorities, like competitiveness, migration, and security, there is a question of how to confirm the shift made in 2020, 2021 toward with the Global Gateway Strategy and a new instrument. Voilà.
Try again. Did you hear that first part? Okay, perfect. But now you will probably hear even better. With the main research interest in identity, history, and discourse in international politics, you have an empirical focus on European and Turkish foreign affairs, and also on the nexus between domestic and foreign policy of middle powers in a changing international order. So with that background, Senem, you must be the perfect person to ask what are the most interesting recent developments in Turkish movements vis-a-vis Europe and Africa.
Okay. Right. Does that? No? Does it work? No? Yeah? Okay. Sorry. All right. Thank you so much. I'll start with Turkey and Europe and then move to Turkey and Africa and try to keep it brief. Now, about the Turkish movement towards Europe, well, I mean, I think if we're focusing on today, what we're seeing is that a Turkey that wants to be on board with the emerging security architecture in Europe after the Russia-Ukraine war, and in particular after Trump's election in the US. So the security and defense relationship right now is the primary issue area through which Turkey approaches Europe these days, just like Europe approaches the Turkey question these days as well. So, of course, I think for Turkey, a scary outcome would be a security architecture in Europe that is relatively autonomous from NATO. Oh, it's not turned on? No. Okay, now? Okay, all right. Because I shout so much, people might assume that it's turned on, but it isn't. Okay, I know. Anyhow, so a scary scenario is one in which you have the security architecture that is relatively autonomous from NATO and that does not have Turkey in it. It is scary, not just from Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, etc., the usual standpoint, but also from the standpoint of the fact that Russia also constitutes a serious threat and a challenge for Turkey in certain regions in which they're in competition, like the Caucasus, for instance, or like the Black Sea. So that is why Turkey has been trying very hard to strike this kind of a balanced relationship with Russia, also during the war. Now, and we've seen it in sort of Turkey's signaling efforts, right, to Europe, like it's willing to send peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, and, it basically wants to take part in the new defense initiatives and the spendings, etc., etc. Now, that's the situation right there from a Turkish perspective. And I think Turkey also sees this new emerging context as an opportunity to remind Europe its membership prospects as well. So we have President Erdogan mention on a number of occasions, not just after the war, but also after Trump's election victory, that, Turkey is actually a candidate country, that its membership prospects should be taken seriously, and this and that. But of course, aside from all the debates that we've also discussed yesterday about, EU public opinion towards enlargement and all that, those absorption capacity debates that we've had over decades, we have the big elephant in the room here, which is, of course, the state of Turkish democracy and human rights and the rule of law. And I think this is the huge elephant in the room that also constitutes a serious problem of mistrust between the two sides. And I think that is the big elephant in the room that prevents much of the collaboration between Turkey and Europe that would be to the huge mutual interest of two sides. And not just from a security perspective, where you'll have selective engagement, but also from an economic perspective. I mean, we have a customs union agreement that needs to be really upgraded, and that would be to the benefit of both Europe and Turkey, and also in the current, global trading environment in which we're talking about, supply chains and about the emergence or the vitalization of the middle corridor. And amidst all these debates, I think this is a very important policy area to focus on, but we all know why it's not been, revitalized, or at least negotiations have not started. The visa issue, for instance, that Turkish citizens have been facing, it's a major hurdle, it's growing, it's becoming a major issue. We don't have any progress on that as well. So again, defense initiatives. I mean, you have this sort of news, we've talked about it yesterday, the safe loans, that Turkey cannot, possibly take part in them, at least as of today, but perhaps through the back door with the partnerships between Turkish defense industries, which is a booming industry, by the way, that Europe could really benefit from, especially in the given context. But again, all of these are becoming kind of areas where you could have much more progress than you actually do, and they're remaining at a suboptimal level. And that has a lot to do with the state of the mistrust that is fueled a lot also by some of the previous Turkish foreign policy overtures, as well as the democracy problem in Turkey, which is growing by the day. Now, about the Africa question, of course, is a completely different story. It's hard for me to connect the two, by the way. But what we have is that we have a Turkey that has an important presence in Africa, and it's not new.
right? It's had that presence, a growing presence in the last 2 decades or so. It has a military presence, you know, from Somalia to Libya to Chad, what have you. It has significantly expanded its economic presence, both through trade, where it grew like 10 times or so in the last 2 decades. Investment levels have gone up the roof. Turkey is a major provider of official development assistance globally as well. It consistently ranks in the top 10, etc. Some industries are particularly active in Africa, like, you know, construction sector. Now, of course, compared to Europe, if you look at it, try to connect it to the broader question of EU global activeness, and then, of course, I'll give the floor to our next speaker. Of course, it's still smaller in terms of the scale of its presence, given that Europe, in terms of scale, is much larger. But if you look at Turkey, I think one can argue that it created a kind of a niche space for itself in engaging with Africa and other parts of the global south by kind of delivering this fast, visible engagement, and also by emphasizing its non-colonial past and history, and thus sort of creating a separate space for its engagements and legitimizing that engagement also in relation to what Europe usually suffers from, and thus a colonial history and baggage. So I'll keep it at that for now, and we can come back to this conversation later maybe. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. I remember seeing a map of the Turkish embassy in Africa, and it's impressive. It's all over, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that maybe not everyone is aware of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Our third panelist, Birgitte Markussen, newly appointed ambassador in Denmark and a Danish special representative for the Great Lakes and the Sahel. Quite an area to balance, yes. Returned to Denmark 2 years ago to be director in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but before then, Birgitte was 7 years in the External Action Service, 3 of them as a EU ambassador to the African Union. And you also have been an ambassador in Burkina Faso, so I think it's safe to say that you're very experienced and have a quite extensive knowledge on the EU-Africa relations. So, Birgitte, based on that experience, how has Africa and maybe the African Union's perspectives of EU changed over time?
Thank you very much. I hope it's working, the mic. And good morning, everyone. I have got 5 points that I want to share with you on this question about the, Is it on? Yeah. Yeah, det mener jeg har. Think so. I can try. I think it's on. If not, I have to shout up. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. All right. So what I want to say before I start my 5 points, 2 things. When you look at politics in Africa, it's global. What happens in Ukraine, what happens in the US, what happens elsewhere has an impact. And that's the other disclaimer, or the other intro I want to give is when we go into relationships with Africa, being Europeans, there's a history, and we need to recognize that. And I think that's just very important. It gives closeness, but it also gives a history that we need to have in the back of our minds. 5 issues that have impacted and changed the perceptions. They go both ways. But the first time in newer times I would look at the COVID-19, the corona crisis. There we know that Europe had problems of getting masks enough, getting ventilators and so on, and that solidarity and that we came a bit late in terms of some Africans, that was important. We have speeded up. I would say EU got out of bed quite quickly, not only waking up, but got out of bed, because in less than a year there was actually vaccine productions in Africa in 4 places. And that's sometimes, having worked 4 years in the EU, I have really sometimes, it moves very, very fast. We can come back to the other challenges. My second point is Ukraine. I was myself based in Addis Ababa. I had to reach out to all. Addis Ababa in African politics is like Brussels. It's where you have the African Union, and I was ambassador for the EU to the African Union. So I had, with pleasure, talking with all my African colleagues. They are very knowledgeable, of course. They said, One thing is it was a dividing issue on the continent. There were really countries speaking up in the Security Council, for instance, Kenya, very famous speech now on sovereignty, because the history of Africa is very much into respecting the borders that came into place also historically, but they respected them because if not, it would have created a lot of problems. Secondly, they just didn't want to be seen to take side in a situation where they knew this was big power games. So, and then they also thought that there were some double standards from the EU side in terms of how we approached other issues of sovereignty. And that brings me to the third issue, which is Ukraine. No, sorry, the third issue is really Gaza. That one you've seen, we can talk more about it, but you've seen, for instance, it's South Africa who brought the case, South Africa versus Israel, regarding Israel's conduct in the Gaza Strip during the Gaza war. So they brought it to the ICJ. So I think that's important, that it was Africa speaking up for the positions in Africa. I'm not taking sides here. I'm just trying to mention what has impacted. The fourth issue is, as other speakers on the panel, the US administration, the new administration. I think that has, you saw the South African president in Washington just this week. They are very good politicians and so on, but it creates a new setting, not only just because on the humanitarian situations where you see US aid funding being dramatically reduced, but which leads me to the fifth point, which is really at what we saw also this week. There was the third EU-AU ministerial in Brussels between the European Union and the African Union. So what this creates at the moment is a perception, coming back to the perception, of the EU to be a predictable partner. And what I've been in many negotiations of text between the European Union and the African Union. And what I saw with a lot of pleasure was, for instance, to see there was a text mentioning Ukraine, which has been an issue, but there was a text there bringing in and guided by the Charter of the UN, those principles uniting, and the solution found was not only to mention Ukraine, but also other situations like Palestine, like South Sudan, like Sudan, DRC, and Sahel. I will stop there with those 5 points. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Birgitte. And we'll certainly return to some of them later in this discussion. I think they will be cross-cutting, and especially also maybe for the next question, which is for all of you. But Senem, you will start. Which are what are some of the main challenges for the EU's global engagement today?
Okay, now is it? Okay. Now it works, right? Okay. Well, of course, first of all, you have the usual suspect challenges, right? Which is the fact that Europe remains fragmented at many levels, that you don't have a unified foreign policy or certain, unified prioritization of why certain regions are more important and for what and what the policy there should be. On top of that, you have, of course, the ongoing war, which creates an existential threat. And when you have an existential security threat on your soil or even borders, then, of course, there's very little else that you can focus your energy on. And I think we have to acknowledge that. The EU, I think, is also right now is in a limbo about what to do with China in the United States. I mean, we haven't discussed that a lot, but I think that is a huge challenge. Whether they should develop sort of compartmentalized relationship with China, focusing on certain issues like climate change. But what about tech? What about tech sovereignty? What will the trade relationship look like? Of course, much of it depends on how US will behave, and it looks like they seem to be having an agreement with the Chinese, but still. So all of these are in a limbo, and I think these are important challenges that Europe has to reckon with. The colonial past is an important challenge, and the ambassador already mentioned that, which brings me to a big challenge, again, that has been mentioned, but I want to unpack that a little bit, if I might, which is the hypocrisy charge that is often labeled against Europe by the actors in the global south. We've written about that a lot academically. I also wrote about it in the context of the hypocrisy charge in the international order. And I think basically what Europe asks from the global south countries regarding the Russia-Ukraine war doesn't always resonate, because they immediately, put it and contrast it with, let's say, the EU's attitude and policies in Israel and Gaza. This creates a massive credibility problem. And this is not the first time that the hypocrisy charge is leveled against the West and Europe, right? I mean, this is a problem of the West as well at large, but of course, since here we're talking about Europe. We've seen the case with Syria as well, right? Again, I mean, coming from a Turkish context, I mean, I have students in class, European students. I have so many Erasmus students, exchange students from EU member states. I have Turkish students, but I also have students from the global south who come as exchange students. And when I teach European foreign policy, this always comes up. And this semester, I realized that it, not just in the context of Israel and Gaza, but also in terms of, they treat Ukrainian refugees different from Syrian refugees, right? And then you try to explain, yes, well, there's a Russia question, and they're at the border and this and that, but it's a challenge to respond to that, okay? So these resonate. You can see that they resonate among the public, they resonate among the youth, and of course, Europe has rival powers now in many parts of the world that it did not have so much for, let's say, earlier 2 decades ago. Now, we mentioned Turkey, but then, of course, Turkey is a relatively minor player when you look at China, right? Or you have other like Russia, or you have the Gulf, which has not been mentioned, right? So there are rival power centers now operating in the world, operating in different scales. And by the way, these rival powers are making use of the hypocrisy charge to delegitimize European actorness and presence in these regions. I mean, we've conducted a study when we looked, for instance, at Turkish discourses in Africa, right? And we've identified a very consistent use of the anti-colonial rhetoric and negative othering of European actorness in positioning the Turkish self and engagement there. And it's not just Turkey does that, right? So as long as Europe does not practice what it preaches, or tries to be at least a little bit more consistent, because basically the problem is this. You might argue that everybody's transactional, nobody practices what they preach, whatever, right? This is international politics, especially if you look at it from a realist perspective, and that's fine. But the problem is the EU assumes that it is a liberal actor. It assumes that it stands for certain values. It keeps on saying that it's multilateral, and that's where the difference lies. And then, of course, that makes it very vulnerable to the hypocrisy charge, and that's why third rival countries also exploit it to the utmost extent, and it does resonate.
Super, thank you, Senem. And one can certainly ask the question, when you have so many potential allies of rivalizing potential partners, what is the interest of Africa to closely align itself with Europe only? I mean,
I was going to raise it in response to your third question. So
okay, perfect. Yeah. Amandine, do you agree on these challenges?
Yes, mostly, absolutely. I was about to leave from the idea of the shifts and the changes I mentioned earlier, and how they have impacted the relationship between the EU and the partner countries and organizations, and to transition directly from what Senem was saying. Like, the first observation we had after following the big research we did on that is that the EU assumes it is expected that partner countries expect its actions, etc. Is so. And on the contrary, that a lot of the persons we talked to, actually, what we saw is that there are way more partners, as Senem was mentioning. There's China, Russia, but also Turkey, the Gulf countries, Brazil, Morocco, Tunisia as well are new partners of African countries, especially. And Europe is one among other partners. In some cases, it's not even the most preferred partner. So the question is, how does the EU take it actually? And we saw that with the Global Gateway strategy in a very competitive way. Like the point I wanted to mention to raise for this to answer your question was maybe there is a need to rethink the partnership dimension because there is really a large spectrum of relationship with the third countries and organizations, and there is a need to clarify the priorities and the way we want to engage with the partners and the way we want to be friends, allies, be in coalitions, etc. And we see that the friendships evolve, and we see that now with the second administration of Trump. And we know that sometimes friends don't remain friends forever. So we need to throw new red lines, to adjust the red lines, and to see how we can navigate this evolving international politics. And for us, so for China, for instance, there was also a point I wanted to make, like maybe there is no way to enter in a direct competition with China. The EU and China don't have the same tools, the same intentions, the same history, as the ambassador was saying. Like maybe there is a way to talk to China with a sectoral approach, because for hydrogen, the critical raw materials, etc., China could be a partner of the EU. It also applies to defense and security matters, for instance. Now there is this coalition of the willings to bypass actually the internal EU resistance and to find strength beyond the EU borders. So then that's really one key element. I would say that all this comes in a context where the narratives, as the ambassador was also pointing, the narratives also in Africa are changing, and there is way more agency of the African countries and organizations, and the EU cannot undermine that. And the EU cannot ask friends or partners to choose or make them feel like they have to choose between others and themselves. So that's really something that, a bit of food for thought for the continuation of the partnerships.
Yeah, certainly. Birgitte, you also mentioned the hypocrisy and these different...
I did not use that word.
No, actually you're right. You did not, because you are a diplomat.
No, there's more to it. I can elaborate on that. There's more to it.
Yeah, but you did mention that there was some different that it has formed the perspectives that there might be different and double standards in some of the international cases, right? Yeah. Are these some of the main challenges? And now we have talked a lot about Africa, and of course Africa is one of the potential international partners, but there might also be broader issues in terms of these partnerships, or could there be other international partners at play in than only Africa? Now I'll let you answer the question on the main challenges, but maybe we can also kind of broaden it out to not only speak about Africa, or see are there other international partnerships out there that you should be aware of or seek?
Thank you very much. And yeah, I choose my words very with a lot of thought, and I also said, because I think if you were to unpack my 5 points, there would be a big discussion from both sides, and that's what I very much appreciate working on the African issues. You can always you just need to decide when, where, and how. But let me look. I've got one major point here on one of the main challenges, and then I'll bring in a few examples of my present role. But I think what we've also discussed yesterday, and my other panelists, is really the world order is quite chaotic at the moment. It is, and what the EU is good at, and what is built on, is a rule-based order. It's to navigate and to have that order and create the order within its own system. So I think the major challenge is really how will the EU navigate in this a world that does not, where you can't expect everybody to play the games of the international order. And I think that's really, I'm not saying, because my glass is always half full. As a good diplomat, I look for the opportunities. This is work up the sleeves, and we get out and we see what can actually be done. So this is something that can be done. And as I mentioned just in my first intervention, if the EU needs to respond quickly, it can respond. But it's a matter of getting everybody in that mood. And even I thought last night, the intervention at the French embassy was interesting to see how member states start to mobilize. And I think that's some of the answers. We will see a world where you have new types of partnerships that goes beyond the EU. Just then, 2 examples very quickly. What we see, for instance, on working on the Great Lakes that I do right now, one of the issues on the table is a deal. The US has offered a deal. And I was in the region, visiting some of the main actors, and they find it quite interesting to have that type of deal approach that the US is offering.
What is the offering?
The offer is they have signed some guiding principles, but very much built on relations, on minerals, on soils and so on and so forth. What one has to look at there as a good European, we also have many investments, and it's to bring that to the forefront. And then I think the EU will be in a very good position to listen to the African offer, because there is an African peace process. And if you don't get that to the table, my analysis would be it would be difficult to get the more sustainable peace, because you need the whole region to act together. Sahel is another story. We will have a meeting actually between Envoys next week under the Polish presidency to discuss what should the new strategy be. Because there are definitely some geopolitics at play, and EU will have to reconsider. But I think my main conclusion is really that we have a chaotic world order at the moment, and we need to look at the EU how to play that game, and we need the European Union to look beyond its own continent. Because I think that's really because to be a global player, we need to look beyond as European Union. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. What I think is kind of going across your answers is this issue of the EU being rule-based, but also driven by or traditionally having values as a guiding for the international partnership and for engagement, also in terms of enlargement, right? And then you said, okay, we have this triangle now, or we have these 3 different issues that we have to balance, which is the EU's value, which might be what we used to guide our approach towards. Then we have the EU interest, which is increasingly then maybe coming up. I wouldn't say they have never been there, but maybe increasingly being something that the EU acknowledge and are maybe also even proud of, or saying that this is part of our international partnership and engagement. And then there is this ownership of the partner countries, the other ones, the ones that we actually want to partner with. What are their interests in this? And maybe that last part has been an issue where the EU has not always listened so much to what is actually on the agenda and interest of the people that we want to, or the countries we want to partner with. What is actually going on over there with the friends that we want to make? What are their interest and concerns in the world right now? You gave the example of a peace process, but are there other kind of ways that you could see how could EU maybe be more, now we're moving a bit into also solutions, but how could the EU be a bit more sensitive to actually listen to what is on the table and in the interest of the partners that we want to engage with?
Thank you.
And it's not just for you; it's all of you can jump in if you. Yeah.
No, thanks a lot for this question. Indeed, that the one of the so I said earlier we did some research on how those shifts, those changes, landed at country level, at partner country level. So we focused a lot on Africa for this research. And we, in some countries, the main problem that was pointed out was the communication issue. There was no communication of those changes. And some of the changes were felt from the European side as it's very internal to the EU, it's the way the EU works, so it doesn't have to be communicated. Although from the African perspective, it does change a lot in terms of predictability, in terms of ownership of the programs. Before, in the previous system, actually the partner countries were co-managing the funds, which they are not anymore. So it's a bit nitty-gritty details and very practical details, but they have an impact on the trust, and you cannot be friends if the trust is broken. So it was really felt hard by some countries, especially where the EU development assistance was very much central in the development process of the countries, like they were very dependent on that. But I think it's evolving. That research was done 2 years ago, and the changes were very recent, and since then there have been the EU has realized it first, I think, and there have been a lot more discussions, engagement with the partner countries and organizations, and we can see that with the results of the EU-AU ministerial this week. Everyone says that the atmosphere was very warm, pleasant. Also the three main priorities that came out, like the economy, work on the blue and green economy together, peace, security, and also multilateralism. And maybe that's where the EU has an added value, because I think that the EU as a global actor is still looking for its added value. Of course, it does a lot of things. It is good at promoting a lot of interests, values, etc. But where is it now? As you said, Ambassador, there is this need to rethink, reshape the multilateralism, and I think the ministerial showed, among other things, that African partners would support that, a stronger role of the EU in shaping that. Sorry, but to define what the EU wants, I think it's key, and that will probably be one key challenge for the presidency also.
Yeah, define what the EU wants, but maybe also listen to what the partner want. But I think we have an issue where both are up in the air, right?
Absolutely, yeah. But yeah, for once, like for the ministerial, apparently there was, but the summit has been postponed and postponed, and the ministerial is preparing the upcoming summit in the fall, and the impression from the African side is to be listened for once. So hopefully it's
the upcoming summit in the fall, which we still don't know where will take place and when will take place, which I think is a point in itself. Now they might have reached something, but I mean it's soon, right? So it's yeah. Senem or Birgitte, would any of you jump into? Yeah, sure. We're not closing now. We haven't even talked about the solutions yet. So, yeah, yes, challenges, yes, yeah.
Well, I think first of all, I'm just going to make 3 points about the way forward, maybe how we can think beyond where we are. Before all of this global engagement business, I think first of all, Europe has to put its house in order. Really, that should be a priority, because without putting your house in order, it would be very difficult to successfully and effectively engage with the rest of the world. And we've been discussing that to some extent yesterday as well, right? The things that need to be done. It's got pretty straightforward. Oh, okay.
I'm so sorry, I'm terrible at this. So yeah, putting your house in order, as I said, that's the first thing that needs to be done. And yes, we've been discussing that. So first of all, there is a defense issue, of course, that needs to be dealt with, the Ukraine issue, Russia question. How I think one of the key issues there that need to be dealt with, and I think Denmark could be well positioned to do this, is to work out the arrangements with NATO, right, in terms of capabilities and division of labor, etc., in defense, which I think is going to be crucially important, because otherwise, I mean, Ian talked about it yesterday. Europe might have to wait at least a decade before it develops those capabilities. So that is going to be crucial. The competitiveness agenda, sustainability agenda. There's a very fine line to tread between competitiveness and sustainability, and that is a big challenge anyway. So I think those are some critical issues that the EU would have to deal with at home. And then beyond that, when it looks outside, to see where, and focus a little bit, where and why it wants to project power. Right? Because you cannot project power to the same extent everywhere. And in some places, you have to work with partners, right? In Asia Pacific, you might have to partner up with some other countries, for instance. Whereas in Africa, perhaps you might go alone, or I don't know. So basically, find out where to work alone, where to go with partners, why and how. So the modality of it and the prioritization of it. And my final and the third point is, and it's already been expressed by the previous speakers, is try to convince your partners, or in Africa or elsewhere in the global south, as to what's in it for them. Right? So approaching Africa now, because of access to critical raw materials, because of, energy transition is hugely important. But then how is that going to be connected to the development agenda, for instance, in ways in which it is not going to be completely inconsistent with the whole EU's development goals, but then there will also be wins for that country. So they would need to know, for instance, that this will, follow with European investment or something, right? Because otherwise they have other alternative partners to go to, and not everybody is very unhappy with China, by the way, right? If you go and speak with them, some of them are extremely happy with what they're offered, and they think that it's not that bad. Of course, we might argue to the contrary, but we're talking about perceptions here of the elites who actually do these deals. So I think it's very important to be mindful of that as well. And of course, this addressing double standards is important. Just look at how countries vote in the UN National, Grand Assembly on these issues. Look where they stand. And if you have a minimal care for human rights in the world, then of course it is unthinkable to stand aside and be silent in the face of genocide. And I'll finish it at that.
Thank you. Birgitte?
Yes.
Maybe you both have a few extra words for some of the challenges, but could also move into some of the very good solutions and way forward from here.
Your good questions. I'll come back to the issue of EU house in order or not. I think one of the premises for the EU is it's quite an open discussion.
Yeah.
So it's there might be other houses that should also be brought in order, but just to make that little disclaimer. No, I think an opportunity during the Danish presidency is on some of the issues we discussed. I think we expect there will be an African Union, European Union summit in Africa. And I think that will be an opportunity to also very much in line with the Danish fairly new strategy on Africa, to listen hard to Africans and bring that into the table. And I think that's something Denmark has been speaking up about. And I think that's quite important. What you will also see is that the agenda is quite wide. It's not just security. It's not just critical raw minerals and so on. It's actually about prosperity, which is growth, investments. It's about enhanced cooperation on the peace, security and governance. It's about the partnerships, also on tricky issues like migration and mobility, where we are two continents that have something that needs to be discussed, which was also agreed upon this week, which is not an easy one. And then the commitment to multilateralism, where I agree. And on that issue, there are some very important issues where the European Union can come in, also during a Danish presidency. I was myself part of the group in the EU who worked hard to get the African Union part of the G20. And that being supportive of other continents to get to the world stage is also an important role, I think, that we could pick up. Last thing is really, others have picked upon it. I think we are in a world today where there's a battle of narratives, we call it. And that one, we simply need to, I think there's a lot of mobilization around it, because here it comes to actually talking about facts, which in some regions and in some forums is very difficult. One of the most interesting presentations I heard recently was about someone talking about truth being a scarce commodity these days. And I just think I think I'll end there, because I think we are also part of this, and we should be aware of our role. We are also part of creating these narratives. So a discussion like today is part of that, and we should be very conscious. We have this tradition of speaking up and speaking, and that's very good, and we should stand up for that. It's part of the narrative. Thank you.
Thank you. And may I just add to that list of issues on multilateralism, and where the EU maybe could listen hard to Africa, is also in climate negotiations, climate financing, and then international tax negotiations, which I'm personally is looking into, where we will start UN negotiations on a framework on international tax cooperation during the Danish presidency. And in that area, we have really seen African countries pushing for UN framework on this, and the European countries working against them. So it's also an area where you can see if you really want to make friends with African countries, then you should also try to see where do they actually have some interest, where it's fairly easy for you to support, right? It doesn't cost Denmark, for instance, much money to support multilateralism in that area. But yeah, Amandine, would you like to end on some of the recommendations for Danish presidency, or at least a way forward for EU in terms of international partnerships?
I wouldn't call that recommendations, but maybe some final thoughts on this. Actually, combining what the ambassador said about the narratives and also how to put the EU in order, the house in order. The Danish presidency will start in July at a very crucial moment, when the Commission will release its proposal for the next long-term budget, the next MFF, Multi-Annual Financial Framework. And it's a bit of a nerdy topic, nitty-gritty discussions, etc. But it shouldn't be, actually. And this should be the occasion. We should take that as an opportunity to actually discuss about the narrative, talk about the narrative of the EU towards its partners, and what do we want to. Before talking about the how, about the budget, we need to talk about the where we're going to and why are we going there. And I think this is important. Otherwise, we won't have an instrument driven by a policy, but really the instrument making the policy. So, of course, we need to talk about flexibility of the instrument of the budget to address crises, emerging challenges, etc. This is key to think about this, because we see that can be that can create limits. But we also need to think of how to match the instrument with the priorities, with the objectives. For now, the investments are high, but the instrument we have now don't allow to support the private sector or incentivize the private sector to mobilize their resources and complement the EU support in partner countries. Also, a lot of attention, a lot of resources are going to the neighborhood, to the enlargement, to security issues, which is, as it was mentioned, existential for the EU. Where do the international partnerships fit? What will be the resources? What do we want from the partners, or not from the partners, but from those partnerships? What attention, what resources do we want to provide to that? So I would also echo what the ambassador was saying. Like, we need to make sure we have a narrative that make sure that we keep our friends in the future.
And maybe even gain some new friends. Do we have any? Oh yeah, we have a lot. Okay. Sorry for not opening up until now. Yeah, can we start here?
I'll keep this short. I came from India, but then I got this master's program. It's called European Master in Human Rights and Democratization. So we worked 1 year, and these were supposed to be the two fine pillars of European Union, abolishing capital punishment, no death penalties. And I see that happening, that even the highest court in India copies the judgments or takes inspiration from Human Rights Court. So my question is this: the global South, as you said about double standards, how are you going to correct this? Because while we are putting all energy on Russia now, which has taken 20% of Ukraine, there is nothing being said about China taking 100% of Tibet. So the global South is observing this, and not only that, yesterday we saw also, consuming all cheap goods from China. So in Asia, the big question is no support for democracy. Why won't we make democracy as one of the founding pillars, which could then improve transatlantic relations? Because America also wants that maybe Europe and United States should go together. So I would like to have some comments on how do we take this challenge in a multipolar world. Thank you.
Sure. We'll just group some questions together. If you could take the two in the back here also, and then you have some time to answer that.
Thanks very much for the insightful session. Başak Alpan from METÜ. I mean, this is not really a question. I mean, I think this is bad news. It's just a figurative question, but I just wanted to air my chest. I mean, do you think that global South is a good word to use anymore? I mean, is there a global South which is monolithic? I think this also adds up to the lack of the EU's perspective, that, we kind of see the global South in a very monolithic way and do not really differentiate between different varieties and different sets of problems. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Sonia Shaban from the TEPSA Secretariat. We said that words matter a lot, so I wanted to bring attention to the term rule-based order, which has been increasingly used and coming from the US and used by political scientists initially as an alternative for international law, to not talk of actually international law standards, soft law and hard law. So I just want to bring attention to that, because the number of time it's mobilized really, bring shadows on the tools we have in international law, the courts we have, and the statements and decisions that can be made, and also the people who use it don't mean the same thing. So I think there is really a need for clarity and to also rethink about our relationship with that concept, because it really doesn't convey the same thing, and we just use it interchangeably. I also think it brings weakness to international law standards, which contributes to the double standards we also seeing today in our approach to different conflicts and so forth. So just one of the points. My questions to you is we talked about development cooperation. At the moment at the European Parliament, there is an effort to possibly make development cooperation and funding to sovereign partners conditional to migration management in the EU or at the border of the EU. I wonder if it's something you've encountered and if it's something that you see as like a route forward, or if it's something actually out of the questions. Can you tell us a bit more? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also thank you for now we're speaking about the importance of narrative. I think it was two good points in terms of what does the narrative also matter. I think we'll gather the rest of the questions. Please keep them short, and then you will have time to pick up on the ones that you've mostly related to. Birgitte, over here.
Thank you very much. I'll be very short. When I listen to you, excellent, by the way, I really like the discussion. Would you agree that the conclusion of all this is that we should definitely forget about the West against the rest narrative in view of what goes on in the United States, but also in view of what you've said about the relationship? And it goes a bit in the direction of not talking about the global South either. That's my point. Then I have a question to Senem, very short. It seems to me sometimes that the enlargement perspective for Turkey is a hindrance to our relationship with Turkey. I have noticed this over the years. Why? Because it creates frustration, it creates humiliation, and it actually sometimes, because it gets in the way of working together. And in the present circumstances, I think there is an extremely strong point to work together on security. So that should be the front, rather than talking about enlargement, which I don't think will happen. Thank you.
Thank you. The two last ones here and here. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Thank you for interesting presentations. I'm Uffe Hvidkjær, Chair of Europe Dialogue and working with African development. So I think my question is to you, Birgitte. Africa's role in the world, AU as member of G20, South Africa has a G20 presidency right now. And also should Africa have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council in some way? And when you are dealing with Africa, I've been, for example, to Kenya 8 times, talking a lot about tribes, actually. Tribal issues, for example, in Kenya. I'm a Luo, so I vote for the Luo president candidate. So how to deal with like tribal issues. You're not used to do that in Europe, for example. Thank you. Sorry? Okay, yeah.
And the last question over here.
Hi, Ian Bodden from the Centre for European Reform. So one very quick observation. I don't think any of you mentioned the role of visa policy in Europe.
Yeah, someone
you
did.
did. Okay, but I mean, it's very striking that refusal rates for Africans are very much higher than they are anywhere else in the world, and that's a real obstacle to business cooperation, academic cooperation, and so on. The question that I had was to Amandine, which is about the global gateway, because it's sort of been launched with great fanfare. But even when we go to Brussels and talk to people in INPA, nobody can ever really tell us what it is and what it's achieving. And I wondered whether your research could help me to understand what is actually happening.
That is too big of a question for. But yeah, each of you 2 minutes to pick up on what you found most interesting. Yeah, Birgitte, will you start?
Yes, please. Thanks a lot. Excellent questions, of course. Issues on democracy. I think that's, I noticed the Indian Minister of Foreign Affairs was here this week. Very interesting interviews, and I think that's something that is there, but could even be more worked on. I think we have shared values there, actually, and I can't help saying that 70% of African population have an aspiration of democracy. It's the challenges are somewhere else. Global South, but this is just my opinion, totally agree. And I think that will evolve as hopefully this multipolar world will evolve. And I want then to pick up on 2 specific issues on international law. Denmark is now in the Security Council, UN Security Council, New York. Part of our campaign was international law, international humanitarian law. So that's definitely, and you have a watchdog there on the council actually to also watching these type of if there are changes of languages there. I think that's a really important issue. Maybe the last thing I'll touch upon is, as it was directly to me, I think G20 is, as I said, a really good forum for the EU to together with the Africans. I think the Africans already, have a strong say, but the African Union also needs to I think pick its themes, but they are in the process of that. On the UN Security Council reforms, and also that's the Danish position. I mean, we have also EU. We worked hard to bring that to the table. It's a broad and interesting process, because you have to, and I'm sure many in this room will know how the Security Council was formed and that historical moment and so on. So but it definitely, Denmark has worked on that agenda also in its campaign for when we were campaigning for the Security Council. This is a bit beyond my present cap, but as being a good diplomat, I know the campaign that we were running. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Amandine? And they're eyeballing me from out there, but I don't see the other people there for coffee yet. So, but still keep it short, please.
Okay, no pressure. Thank you very much for all the questions. I will start with the one on the European Parliament, and I keep postponing the drafting of one commentary on that, because actually we see this year, but it started already 6 years ago with the President mandate legislative MEPs. There is a shift of narrative there too, and this year it's really stronger, because there is one more group of far right MEPs, etc., and also because I feel the alliances within the Parliament, within the DV committee, for instance, the EPP group allied with the two far rights, the ECR and the Patriots, for the opinion of the budget, which indeed opened the door quite wide open, the door to conditionality of migration and border management. Also on economic interests, but this is indeed something new from the Parliament, who is traditionally kind of the safeguarding of the traditional development cooperation, sustainable development, human development approach, etc. Now I have 30 seconds to explain what the Global Gateway strategy is about.
I think you need to take that over coffee.
Yeah, exactly. No, but I just wanted to say that the Global Gateway strategy puts investments and infrastructure first, and that's really key. And that is, I make the link with also for the discussion during coffee, with the democracy support question, because actually that overshadows all the support that has been very key for the European development cooperation so far on democracy, human rights, governance, politically and more financially. So very interested to talk about it, because those are two topics I work daily on. So
super.
Just three words on the Global Gateway, and then there are actually at least 10 transport corridors across Africa where the Global Gateway is investing. So just to, I'll be happy to share a map, and we'll get one from the European Union.
Super.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, super. Senem, the last.
I'm going to start with Ian's comment and then move on to Jim's question, because I think they're connected. Now, the visa issue is not just an issue regarding EU's relations with Africa. It's even an issue with EU's relations with Turkey, as I tried to make out, because visa rejection rates right now for Turkish citizens are at a record high, and students cannot visit. Exchange students cannot go, university students cannot go. They have to wait for months and months and months, and mostly they're rejected without any reason, and it's absolutely horrendous. And the reason for that, the EU officials tell us that that's because asylum requests from Turkey has gone up a lot. Now, why is that happening? Because of the way in which the country is governed, because of democracy, rule of law, bad management of the economy, all of it, right? That young people or others don't see a future in themselves increasingly, as also demonstrated in the recent protests since March. Now, and that's connected to an enlargement policy gone wrong. And there I'm going to respond to Jim's question. Now, but I will respond to it in a different way, because I think what a risk that Europe is facing today with other enlargement countries in the queue is what happened with Turkey. That is losing the countries on the way, right? Because for good or bad, Turkey has made important strides in democratic reform during those times that enlargement policy was relatively credible and things were moving in the right direction, right? And they could have moved in that direction and we could be having a completely different conversation right now. But we're not, right? And of course, part of it has to do with Turkey and its domestic dynamics, but a lot of it also has to do with the EU and the nature of enlargement policy and how it really was not credible from a very early stage onwards, right? So I think that's important. Now, the big question there, of course, is perhaps the EU should rethink about this enlargement policy in ways in which it's not going to lose others along the road, right? And perhaps even include Turkey in the fold, which is why I think it's still important to even on paper have Turkey as an enlargement country. Because if you don't, then you're assuming that this government will be here forever, which I personally very much doubt. If you look at people's satisfaction with the government, about more than 60% are not satisfied. In the youth, this goes up to 75%, right, that take it to the streets. So it's very difficult for a country not to change, right, in the medium run at least, while all of this is happening. And a country like Turkey that doesn't have natural resources, et cetera, and all the other factors that we can discuss, right? So I think we should think of it in the longer haul because, and that's going to be my final words, I don't think you can have meaningful security cooperation with a country whose foreign policy largely hinges on the requirements of regime security. And that's what Turkish foreign policy today is built on, because it can be volatile, because it relies on transactional personal relationship with other autocrats, right? And that is precisely the reason why EU today is engaging in selective security cooperation with Turkey, and it doesn't trust it. So if you remove enlargement from the queue, from the picture, I don't think things will get better. I think, in fact, just the opposite should happen. The EU should resort more to a democracy agenda if it wants to make the most out of its relationship with Turkey, and if in the longer run, right? And by the way, to be fair,
I think we have to stop here.
And I think this is an important point. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there is also something there for the coffee break, which will now, due to my poor time management, be extremely short for you. And I'm sorry about that. But please join me to thank you, the panel.
Thank you.